Hi, I'm Jen Wagner of Snapdragon Quilting. I'm a quilt pattern writer and quilting instructor. Thanks for joining me in my studio today. In this video, we're going to be covering my latest quilt, the Sunshine Puff Quilt. Isn't it adorable? And it just makes me want to poke it with these cute little three-dimensional puffs. This quilt is actually much easier to make than it looks. These sunbeams are constructed using simple foundation paper piecing. And if you've never used that technique before, no worries. Today I'm going to show you exactly how that technique is done. Foundation paper piecing is awesome for quilting because it stabilizes the fabric, getting rid of stretch, creating consistency. So all my blocks look the same and they all come out exactly the same size when I'm done making them, which makes it really easy to add a little bit of sashing and stitch them all together. Before we jump into that technique, I'm going to show you an alternate design option. So if you don't want to make sunshines, you can make it look different.
If we change where the color is in the block, instead of having white in the corner, we throw in a color, then when we put all the blocks together, these X's emerge and it's a super fun design. And then we can look at it with that same X shape, but in bright colors. It's always fun to play with design, and so I do have coloring pages in the links below if you want to play with this design and see how it looks with different colors and different fabrics.
To get started with foundation paper piecing, we need foundation paper piecing templates. I like to use regular copy paper, but you can use foundation paper if you'd like. It's a little bit thinner, and some say it's easier to tear out. So go ahead and open up your pattern, and inside you're going to find some folded inserts. The first one that you'll see is this one, and this is a complete block template. And so if you want to not have to piece together your foundation templates, you can just take this to your local print shop and copy it to make as many blocks as you want. There are also templates that are regular sized paper, and so you can copy these at home and print these at home, and then it does have guidelines where you would cut these and then tape them to the other pieces so that you get the complete template. To make it easier, you can put these pieces on a window or on a light box so the light shines through and it's easier to match up all of the pieces. Once you've put it all together with some Scotch tape or some like a glue stick, then go ahead and you're going to cut out the center and also cut the stitching line between the first and last shape. I don't like to cut the outside of my pattern at this point because I like to trim that at the very end. You'll notice a couple things on this pattern. The first thing is the numbers, and those numbers are your sequence to add fabric. So we're simply going to start with shape number 1 and then work our way around. I have this upside down. There we go. Start with shape number 1 and work your way around the template.
Foundation paper piecing can be done using scraps or fat quarters or even yardage. But with this pattern, I decided to make it really easy and give you templates. There are only 4 shapes in these blocks. And so we can take each of these shapes, cut them out from the paper, and then I like to take each template and print it twice and tape it on the underside of a ruler I would use for rotary cutting. I've intentionally used a clear ruler here so it's easy to see, but you can use one with a grid on it. And this way I can cut the left edge of my template and I can cut the right edge using the same ruler. And on these strips it tells you if you're making the sunshine quilt in the sunshine layout, then use the yellow fabric from a 4-inch strip. So I've already cut this edge, and so then I can go ahead and line that edge that I've cut on the edge of my fabric, and I've got this edge here. And because I am right-handed, I am actually going to turn this around. So I'm going to line this back up, and so I'm using the template shape to match the top and bottom of my strip, and then you can see right here the edge I've already cut is lined up, and then I can cut this. And then I can just turn it around and I can cut the next one. And so I'm just alternating cutting the right and left sides of each template. And if I need to cut a lot of these, I could have stacked up 2 or 3 of these 4-inch strips. So I was cutting lots of shape A all at once. And then I can go ahead and do that with the rest of my shapes. This would use a 4 1/4 inch strip and the various strips for each piece. The only caution that I have is if you're using a print, there are some of these that do have mirror images. So I'm going to give you an example from shape B. And on my foundation paper piecing template, it does tell me which of the cutting templates, a shape cut from C, I would use for 20. This one is cut from B, and you can see I would put it here. But if I am using a print and I try and use the same exact piece and put it on the next B, it doesn't fit. Instead, I would have to use it upside down. So if you are using a print, cut half of your B's and half of your C's upside down. B's and C's upside down, half of them. Once I have enough of my fabric shapes cut out, then I'm going to start putting them onto my foundation paper piecing template. The template where it is printed is actually the back of the block. And so we're going to be putting our fabric on the non-printed side. And so I like to put shape 1 on, which is this shape right here. I like to glue it down. So I'm using Soline's glue pen. This is washable glue. I always glue on my paper, not on my fabric, because the texture of the fabric grabs a lot of glue. And I only need just a little bit to make it stick and hold in place until I've stitched this seam. It is important that we have enough fabric all the way around shape A. And on this template, this outer green line is actually giving me my seam allowance. And so I can take my fabric and I can keep it nice and close to that. There we go. Up close to that green line, that flat edge, because later we are going to be using this extra fabric. And so as best as you can with this pattern, keep the edges close to the green line and leave the extra hanging over the edge inside the circle. It's really important to make sure we have fabric all the way around the shape that we're working on. And a great way to do that is to use a light box like I am here. And I can see all the way around that I have enough fabric. Once I have shape 1 where I want it, then I'm going to start worrying about shape 2. And shape 2 is going to be from white fabric. You can see it will cover here. But before we put this fabric on, we are going to use the add a quarter ruler. The original add a quarter ruler has this lip on the underside, which will sit against a fold of paper, and we can cut to create a perfect 1/4 inch seam. The newer add a quarter plus rulers also have a tapered edge, which we are going to use now. And we're going to place this right on the stitching line between shapes 1 and 2 and fold this over and give it a nice sharp fold. So then I'm going to take this lip on the underside of the ruler and set it up against that fold. And you can see it stays right up against it quite well. And now I have this perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I can trim off the extra fabric. Once I have done that, I am worried about shape 2, which I've drawn here with a pencil, which is a great idea. If you're new to foundation paper piecing, you can always draw the shape on the back side of the template where we're adding fabric. And you can see that I can line these edges up together, and it's going to cover the shape completely. And I'm trying to keep it close. This is the green line here, so that I have extra dangling over. But we need to put these fabrics right sides together. So I'm simply going to put it on the underneath side, keeping, if this was a print, I would keep my print face up and put my prints right sides together. And I'm just going to line up my raw edges, and I'm going to scoot it down so it's going right along this line. And then let's look at this. And oh, I wiggled a little bit. Now let's look and see how this looks under the light box. So I can see I have plenty of white fabric here. I have some white fabric hanging out over here too. And if you don't have a light box or a window, another great method is the peek method. So I'm just putting my fingers on this edge of shape 2, and I can lift it up and I can look and I can see that I definitely have enough white fabric. The peek method is also great. When we go to stitch this, we're going to bump our stitch length down to 1.5. That makes a tiny little stitch, which makes tearing the paper out really easy. However, that tiny stitch is not fun to pick out. So I strongly recommend at this point, you really check and make sure that you have plenty of fabric before you sew. And if you're using the cutting templates, I have given you plenty of margin around the edge. The cutting templates will cover it beautifully. And so all you have to do is line up your shape on the raw edge that you just cut, and then just double check and make sure your shape is covered while the paper is folded. Then we're going to just open up our paper, keeping our fabrics together, take this to the sewing machine and stitch directly on this line, all the way across this line using a 1.5 stitch length. I like to use my regular foot, keep my needle in the middle, and stitch straight down that line. So here I have stitched on my line, and you can see here's my piece of fabric and it's on there beautifully. Now I don't like to get up and go to my ironing board because I can have all of my papers and I can have all of my pre-cut shapes all sitting right by my sewing machine, and I can chain piece these, meaning I stitch one right after the other. So if I were doing all 12 of these blocks, I would have stitched the fabric on for shape 2 for all of my blocks all at once. It makes it a lot simpler. Because I'm trying to do this quickly, I don't want to get up, and so instead of ironing, I use a seam roller. And so I'm going to pull open this fabric, and it's important that we don't get extra fabric in here. We want the fabric pulled up against the stitching because we're working on accuracy here. And then I'm just simply going to roll this, and then I can move on to the next shape. And after this, it's the same thing over and over. I'm worried about shape 3 using a fabric piece B, which would be this one. And then I'm going to take my add a quarter ruler, put it on the line, give it a good fold, and then I would put this up against the fold, and if I had my cutting mat, I would cut this again, and then I would line up my fabric, right sides together, and go stitch, double checking that it's covered. And I'm going to repeat this process, adding one piece of fabric at a time until I get all the way around my block. And so you can see there is an opening here between shapes 1 and 24. And this last seam is easy to do. I simply can use my light box, and I can put these right sides together and double check that I've lined this up, or I can put a pin in, and I put it in right at the pink. So I know that that part of my seam is matching, and I can do another one over here. I can just put this in right here at the pink, and right there at the pink. And now I've got this lined up, and I think the easiest way to do it is to go back to my glue and glue this seam, get it right where I want it. Perfect. And then I can take my pins out, and I can go and I can stitch right up against the edge of my paper, and my block will be finished. Now that we have the final seam stitched, we have a hole in the center of our block that we need to fill. And we can't put the puffs on at this point because it would make it very difficult to sew all the blocks together, and it would make it really difficult to quilt. So we're actually just going to fill this hole with a circle of fabric that is flat first to provide stability for assembly and quilting. In the pattern, there is a circle template with 3 different circles, and you can go ahead and cut each of these circles out so that you have 3 circles of the correct size. We are going to be starting with the 3.5-inch circle, which will fill that hole that is in each of our blocks. To do this, I can take a piece of fabric and I could take my marking pen and trace around it, and then take some scissors and I could go and I could cut this out. It's going to take a long time, and that is a good option, but there is an easier way, and that is to use the Circle Savvy ruler by Creative Grids. This circle ruler cuts circles from 3 inches to 15.5 inches in both 1/2 inch and full inch sizes. This ruler comes with fabulous instructions, but they are easy to lose because they're paper. And if your craft room's like mine, sometimes paper walks away. So there is a little QR code here you can scan to remind you how to use it. It also has a quick guide here. If you're going to cut a 1/4 circle, you would cut it from a square of fabric. If you're going to cut a 1/2 circle, you would fold your fabric in half and then cut it. If you're cutting a full circle like we are today, we're going to fold our fabric twice to fold it into quarters. This first circle that's 3.5 inches, it is going to be covered later, and so it doesn't matter what fabric you cut it out of. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it out of a scrap of white fabric that I have, and like our ruler told us, we're going to fold it in half once and then fold it in half again. And now I have a piece of fabric that has been folded twice, or folded into quarters. Now on this ruler, you're going to see that there are fold lines and seam allowance lines. Since we have folded our fabric in half twice, we're going to be using the fold lines. I would move this over here. The other lines would be used if we were cutting 1/2 circles or 1/4 circles, but we are doing the full circle. We have 2 fold lines. So I'm going to line up those fold lines on each of the folds of my fabric. I'm going to use a regular 45mm blade, but you can use a smaller 28 to make it easier through this small circle. The tricks to make it through smoothly are to use a sharp blade, keep your blade straight up and down, don't let it fall open as you go through, and then keep your blade pressed up against the inside edge of the slot. So start here by putting it in the opening, keep it straight up and down, go slow, and keep it pressed up against the inside edge. I'm going to try not to bump the camera. There we go. And then we will have a little 3.5-inch circle. So this ruler is a quick trick for cutting out circles. Now it's time to take this circle that we've cut out and put it on our block. And if we hold this block up to a window or a light box, you can see where the paper ends all the way around. And so it makes it very easy to center this because that hole is exactly the same size as the circle that we've cut. I like to use a little bit of Elmer's school glue. Again, it's washable. This is actually a starch, not a glue. And I like to put a bead of glue on this fabric all the way around, tacking this in place. And that makes this really easy to go to the sewing machine, and I can sew this on and it won't shift. And you notice I didn't trim any of these pieces that we had used when we were foundation paper piecing, which is fine. I'm going to cover them later with a puff. It doesn't even matter that they're there. So you don't have to worry about those. They will be covered. And we want to have the fabric there so that we can stitch down this anchoring circle. Once I have glued this all the way around, I can leave it and I can set it to dry, or I can take an iron and I can press this and it will dry out the glue. Just make sure you don't use steam because we want the glue dry, not wet. And when I go to stitch this, I don't care if it looks pretty or not, because no one's ever going to see it. It's going to be under the puff. And so I'm going to stitch with my needle in the down position and stitch just maybe 1/8 of an inch away from this edge just to secure this circle in place. Stitching this circle down is going to complete the structure of our block. However, we still have extra fabric around these outside edges. And this is why I did not trim my paper to start. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And so I'm going to take my ruler and I can just line it up on these green lines, and then I can take my rotary cutter and I can trim all the way around this block to finish it up. Once my blocks are trimmed, then I'm going to sew them together with all of the cornerstones and sashing as we would with any traditional quilt. And then it's time to quilt the quilt and bind it. And then we're going to make the puffs. So we're going to take the largest circle from the pattern templates, and we can, again, trace it onto fabric and then cut it out with scissors, or you can use the Circle Savvy ruler to cut the circles out. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch with a basting stitch. A basting stitch is a longer stitch length. I set this to 3.5, and I'm going to create 2 rows of stitching all the way around. One trick is to stitch with your needle in the down position, so as you need to, you can pause and lift your presser foot and readjust the fabric. Now, this doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be roughly in this position here. Now, don't use your fancy thread cutter when you're doing these, because we want to leave the tails long. Before we start gathering it, if you used the paper template to trace and cut these out, fold your circle in half twice to get press marks. If you use the ruler, the press marks will already be there. And do that with the medium-sized circle also, because then as we gather this and try and put these 2 pieces together, we will have our circles divided up into segments, so we can match the segments together and keep our gathering even. So then it's time to start pulling on the threads, and either pull the threads from the top or from the bottom, it doesn't matter, just pick a side. And then take one of the threads and gently start pulling on it to create a gather. And I think it helps to completely pull this all the way and get it all the way around so that it looks nice and tight. And then once it's nice and tight and I've gathered both of those edges, then I can start easing this out. So I'm going to even my gathering out and pin it to the medium-sized circle. And once I pin this all the way around, then I can go to my sewing machine and again stitch with my needle in the down position so that I can lift my foot and turn my fabric. And I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to do a regular stitch length of 2.5 and stitch all the way around this circle. I am going to leave a small opening so that when I'm done, I can start working to turn this right side out, and then I can stuff it with fiber fill. Before you have it stuffed and filled though, take out the basting that is showing. We don't need it anymore. It was just there to hold the gathering evenly so that it was easier to stitch. So take that out, and then we can stuff fiber fill in this hole. I used a 1/2 ounce for each of my puffs to make them firm, but not hard as a rock.
Once you have your puffs all stuffed, then take a needle and thread and by hand stitch up that little bit of an opening that we had left. Once you have all of your puffs made, then we need to put them on the quilt. And a good trick is to take another copy of the foundation paper piecing templates. Instead of cutting on the first circle, cut on the next circle so that this hole is a little bit bigger. And then you can take your template and center it on a block. Let's just imagine my puff's not here. So I've got my template centered on a block, and then I take a vanishing marking pen or a marking pen of your choice, and I can draw on the edge of the paper to create a perfectly centered circle. And that can be my guideline so that I can hand stitch my puff on. So find a good movie, stitch all your puffs on, and then your quilt's complete. If you enjoyed today's video, I would love to have you in one of my classes or come to your guild to teach. If you would like to make this quilt, you can get this pattern at your local quilt shop or on my website following the links below. If you're a quilt shop and you would like to carry the Sunshine Puff pattern or any of my patterns in your shop, they are available through all US major distributors. Thanks for joining me in my studio today, and don't forget to like and subscribe. and tell your friends. Thanks.